I would like to welcome you all to the second day of Modern Money, Aesthetics After the Gold Standard, a conference that asks how chartalist or state-based understandings of money might reorient critical encounters with aesthetic and cultural artifacts, past and present. Yesterday, we heard from scholars of art history, literature, and other media who together have begun to construct a language that on one hand puts chartalism's politicized vision of money in contact with the contradictions of modernity and modern cultural production, and on the other transfigures art and aesthetics in light of chartal money's historical power. The result, I think, has been nothing short of astonishing. While reaching no positive consensus, the panelists' diverse and very singular contributions seem to have nevertheless crystallized around a shared constellation of problems and concerns. In doing so, it seems to me, Modern Money inaugurates a new way of wondering about how things might start to look and feel when we resist the temptation to reduce the money culture circuit to a field of private commodity relations. Today, we wish to expand and further complicate this wondering by approaching the money culture nexus from a heterogeneous and equally singular perspective. For this, we turn to our featured speaker, Yanis Varoufakis. Born in Athens in 1961, Yanis Varoufakis earned his PhD in economics from the University of Essex and has held academic appointments at the universities of Essex, East Anglia, Cambridge, Glasgow, Sydney, and Athens. He served as economic advisor to Greek Prime Minister George Papandreou before resigning in 2006, and is currently a visiting professor at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. A modern monetary theory fellow traveler and a self-described erratic Marxist, Varoufakis has made a career out of exposing the limits of the neoclassical economics in which he was trained, as well as its ideologically bankrupt mathematical models. Since 2008, he has emerged as a major critical voice in debates surrounding the global financial crisis and the ongoing devastation of the Eurozone. A noted contributor to the BBC, Die Zeit, and the New York Times, and other publications, Varoufakis is perhaps best known for his texts, The Global Minotaur, The True Origins of the Financial Crisis and the Future of the World Economy of 2011, with several updates along the way, and A Modest Proposal for Resolving the Eurozone Crisis, 2010 through 2013, the latter of which he co-authored with economists Stuart Holland and James Kenneth Galbraith. While the former book wholly rethinks the post-Bretton Woods global economy and the structural circumstances that led to its collapse, the latter text proffers decisive steps for overcoming Europe's economic crisis in order to address immediate social emergencies. We, the conference organizers, have invited Professor Varoufakis to speak with us today, neither as a representative of MMT chartalism nor as an expert in art history, but rather as a thoughtful and trenchant critic of capitalism and culture whose own erratic trajectory has dropped him squarely in the chiasmatic locus where money and aesthetics meet. Indeed, in addition to his writings on political economy, over the past several years, Varoufakis has made crucial interventions into the spheres of culture and art. Such interventions have not only extended problems of political economy to the cultural and technical processes that variously shape contemporary life, but have also done so through Varoufakis' own forays into aesthetic production and collaboration. I invite you to explore Varoufakis' ongoing project by visiting his blog, Thoughts for the Post-2008 World. There, you will discover penetrating technical interventions into contemporary economic crises, a series of important writings on the political limits and promises of digital economies and so-called cryptocurrencies, and a growing archive of multimedia collaborations with artists Danae, Stratou, and others, such as Cut 7 Dividing Lines of 2007, The Globalizing Wall, 2010 through 2012, and the rather extraordinary Of Public Phones and Besieged Humans, 2014. The latter work is an impressionistic photo and literary montage concerned with migration, dislocation, and systemic debt crises, which insists upon the world historical stakes of quotidian social encounters and the political, economic, and technological forces that mediate them. With this, Varoufakis seems to be diving headlong into what is often called the essayistic tradition, or better, counter-tradition of writing, that artful and emphatically self-implicating mode of social tarrying practiced variously by the likes of Michel de Montaigne, Virginia Woolf, and the inimitable Frantz Fanon. For now, please help me in welcoming Professor Varoufakis to share his talk, Post-Modern Money, on the nature and aesthetics of money in the post-2008 world.
What can I say? Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, everyone, for the invitation, for your presence. Now, this invitation and this lecture is more important to me than you think, because living amongst the econ is a very peculiar tribe. One needs such escape hatchets. All my life, I felt like a sleeping spy behind enemy lines, leading a double life, or like an atheistic monk in some Middle Ages monastery. Now, my partner, Danae, Stratou, some time ago, offered me an escape route. But nevertheless, I still operate as an academic economist, which means that during the day, at least, I have to keep up the pretense of being an economist and participating in narratives that are toxic, pretending to be respectful towards them. So I don't need to do that today, and therefore, I thank you for the opportunity. Now, you asked me to address you on modern money and its post-gold standard aesthetics. I thought I should begin by sharing with you my first memories of means of exchange and stores of value. This is the official definition of money in economics, means of exchange and stores of value. Okay, here's the first one. I was around 6 when I was given a chocolate bar which contained this card. And unbeknownst to me, this was a very, very rare card. And there were other kids in school that collected them. Suddenly, I found myself with social power never experienced before. I was showered with love, compliments, party invitations, dozens of other cards with which to start my own collection. In the end, I kept it, thinking that the power it bestowed upon me would last forever. Of course, it didn't. Now, years later, I would come across Karl Marx's writings, most poetic writings, which resonated with that experience. It was a little bit like understanding that money is like the number -1. When you multiply it with other numbers, you get their opposite. So money makes the ugly attractive, Marx said, the lame mobile, the bad honored, the dishonest trustworthy, the stupid talented, the desirous fulfilled. Money turns incapacities into their contrary, in other words. It obliterates natural qualities and replaces them with social aspects. In his wonderful words, money is the alienated ability of mankind. Gold-gilded or made out of paper, plastic or digital, fiat or backed by real assets, money operates like value's ethereal alter ego, reflecting part of our energies, which has turned post-human, alien, beyond the pale. Now, for Schopenhauer, money confronts not just our needs, but need itself. And to the extent that Schopenhauer was right about music, that it is the voice of the deepest reality possible, money in this sense is a little like history. It rhymes musically. It represents the best and the worst about our humanity. A little bit like Wagner's operas. Wallace Stevens thought along Schopenhauer lines that the sole truth about the human condition is its irredeemable poverty, which can only be confronted by poetry. So perhaps then Andy Warhol was right that money is poetry, since it can do something about alleviating poverty. My second memory of money had a steeliness about it, a hard edge. Soon after that episode of inheriting the Magic at the Spell card, on the 21st of April 1967, this happened. A coup d'etat turned Greece into a quite sizable concentration camp. Members of parliament were tortured, and this particular one was murdered soon after that. Close family were in jail. But perhaps worse of all, we had this kind of aesthetic to destroy, our visual life. This is the dictator's chosen symbol, a desecration of the great myth of the phoenix rising from its ashes. We had to endure that in our school textbooks and also on our money. I was struck as a kid that the army could change the face of our coins, the coins with which I bought chocolate bars, looking for another Magic at the Spell. Oops. We'll come to him in a minute. Now, during the 7 years of this interminable dictatorship, I spent a lot of time with my grandmother. And I was partly responsible for orchestrating the family's great operation of lying to her about her son, trying to convince her that he was on a very extended business tour. He was away on business while he was languishing on death row as part of his opposition to the dictatorship. Now, during those long days and nights with grandmother, I remember we were watching some sitcom on black and white Greek telly depicting, these great rich families and their feuds and so on. And she turned around and said to me, and I have a vivid recollection of that. She said, all the world's problems would have gone away if money had an expiry date. If you were forced to spend any money you got within a week of getting it, then we could all start again on Monday. I asked her why she was saying that, awfully scornful of a grandmother who had been forced by life to leave school in year 3 of primary school. And she responded, if the rich were forced to spend all that money very quickly, they couldn't accumulate wealth, and then there would be more for everybody to go around. Now, her proposal of sorts never ceased to bother me, if only because I wasn't exactly sure as to why she was wrong. More recently, when I say more recently, I'm talking 2 weeks ago, I heard this man, that some of you may know him as the Prince of Darkness, Larry Summers, give a lecture, which actually was a pretty good lecture. This is a terrible thing of the era we live in. Some of the worst people make the most sense. And he was actually arguing that during this crisis of ours, with 0 interest rates, not managing to shift the economy out of its torpor at the moment, perhaps the solution of this crisis, secular stagnation, as Larry Summers calls it, perhaps we need digital money that will allow us to impose negative interest rates in order to force the rich to spend. And then he added, if not, and this is verbatim, if not that, at least a form of money that, if you do not spend it within a certain period of time, it vanishes into thin air. Grandma, apologies. Now, these are some Greek coins, just as a background, but I'll come to them in a minute. My grandmother had a non-existent relationship with money. She lived outside the moneyed economy as a wife. During the Nazi occupation, there was no money. Hyperinflation had ensured that the economy was demonetized. And then after the war was over, she was a living granny looked after by her kids and minding the grandchildren. This is perhaps why she could afford to take an abstract look and preempt Larry Summers by many decades. Let's follow her down that abstract path for a moment, shall we? Now, money is the most metaphysical of quantifiable economic variables. It falls somewhere in between facts and norms. The fact that for centuries it took a metallic form may not be coincidental, as metals are, at least that's how I understand them, the most metaphysical of materials. Gold's glimmer, weight, its imperviousness to rust, to the passage of time, has always made it impossible for us to treat it with disinterest. But it is not only gold that captures the imagination, rendering it a candidate for the transition from material to immaterial social power, to money. Now, my father is a metallurgist, and he used to bring home coins like this as part of his research. As part of his research and his great love for iron in particular, he didn't care for gold that much. He alerted me to the magical effect that the discovery of how to harden iron had on the ancient Greeks and beyond. How turning a soft, useless metal into a hard metal simply by heating it up and immersing it in water, that was something that captured the imagination. He pointed out that Homer, in his Odyssey, when he was trying to narrate in his most dramatic and epic way the blinding of Polyphemus, of the Cyclops, by Odysseus, he used the following words. Odysseus, this is my translation. Odysseus plunged his spear into the Cyclops' soul eye as a blacksmith plunges a hatchet into cold water to temper it. For this is what gives strength to iron. And it makes a great hiss as he does so, and Cyclops screams. Even thus did the Cyclops' eye hiss round the beam of olive wood. The hot iron's hiss, when plunged into water, produced weapons of steel that won great wars. Around that time, it became fashionable to adorn Mycenaean princesses with jewelry made of iron, not gold. In another passage, this time from the Iliad, Homer refers to episodes where noble Trojans, caught by the Achaean leaders, pleaded for mercy and offered for their release a ransom of gold, this is Homer's words, of gold, copper, and more valuably, glittering iron. So it seems to me that iron, being the modern technology of that time, that era's version of digital or binary alternatives to antiquated glimmering gold, was promoted as a more modern form of money. The form of money more in tune with modern technology of the era, and indeed more useful in oiling the cogs and the wheels of society without throwing grit and discord into them. By this what I mean is that, for instance, Lycurgus, or you may pronounce him differently, we pronounce him Lycurgus, the king of Sparta, famously banned gold and silver coins from Sparta. And his argument was that, well, his policy was to impose as the sole currency of Sparta iron spits. They could be used to monetize the economy, that was his argument, and allow for society not only to be monetized, but not to be too impressed by the color, glimmer, and beauty of its money. Typical Spartan, right? Now, historians, and this is no mere convention, divide human epochs in ages associated with particular materials, not all of them metallic. So we had the Stone Age, we had the Paleolithic, the Neolithic age, and then, of course, history probably begins with the Bronze Age. Suddenly, once we move from stone to bronze, history gets moving. Then we progress to the Iron Age, when history sped up considerably. It was not counted in the eons, but it was counted in the decades. It sped up further when iron hardened, the way we described. And we had the Age of Steel. The Middle Ages was a lacuna, evidenced by the fact that it was not known in terms of some material, but in terms of middle. Then we move to the Age of Steam, with the first Industrial Revolution, and the age of the electron and electromagnetism that powered the second Industrial Revolution, and a revolution which brought us the network corporation, the big banks, and the first phase of financialization, of course. But you have noticed, I hope, the absence of a golden age. There's an iron age, a bronze age, but there's no golden age. Indeed, the only golden age we ever had, at least in our collective imagination, is the one that started after the death of the gold standard, after the Second World War, the Bretton Woods era. Now, we shouldn't, of course, miss the golden age, because as Gore Vidal once said, the problem with golden ages is that if you live in them, everything looks a little bit yellow. Setting this aside, seriously now, capitalism's golden age, the post-war period during which we had strong growth of incomes and massive reductions in inequality. This is a unique moment in human history. It happened under the dollar standard. Now, the dollar was linked to gold, but only theoretically. It was as if there was a specter of gold hovering above our heads, hanging in midair, offering a false sense of security. Then, on 15th of August, 1971, something major happened. John Connolly, the Texan who had been in JFK's car on that fateful day in Dallas and actually injured by the same bullet, that magic bullet that had a trajectory that only a magician could conjure up. By 1971 was the Treasury Secretary of President Nixon. And he convinced the president to put the gold specter to rest and to sever all links between money, dollars, and gold. What I love recounting, because this is an expression that I only found out in the last 2 or 3 weeks as part of my research into a book I'm writing now. I heard from a real eyewitness or ear witness that this is the expression that he used to convince Nixon that he should sever the link between the dollar and gold. Mr. President, he said, the connection of the dollar with gold is killing us. It is allowing the French, the Germans, and the Japanese to deplete our gold and drive us into recession. We must screw these foreigners before they screw us. It was thus that the spectre of gold was put out to pasture once and for all. Capitalism was to be fully and willfully disintegrated. In the words of another conspirator during that time, somebody who was working with John Connolly, this gentleman, Paul Volcker, who was later to become the chairman of the Fed in 1978. 2 weeks after this gentleman became chairman of the Fed, he explained what it was that the Americans were doing in the early 1970s. He said, this was in a speech he gave at the University of Warwick, 1978, verbatim, balancing the requirements of a stable international system against the desirability of retaining freedom of action for national policy, the United States opted for the latter. A controlled disintegration in the world economy is a legitimate objective for the United States in the 1980s. It was around that time that Europe became unhinged. This is my way of promoting my next book, which is called Europe Unhinged. The European Union that was just like the German Constitution and the Bundesbank, the central bank of Germany, the equivalent, the German Fed, American inventions and designs. I don't know whether you know that, but the German central bank was designed and put together by the United States. The European Union, which was also an American product, this is very un-European to say, to admit that it was not a European endeavor. It doesn't make me particularly popular in Europe to say that, but I'm not very good at caring. This European Union, which was being stabilized throughout its existence by the United States, as a result of this controlled disintegration of the world economy, went into a tailspin. And how did it try to react? By creating its own gold standard in the middle of Europe. It's what you know as the euro. Today, and for the past few years, Europe is being torn apart by this common currency, whose inspiration was gold. A fixed supply of money, hard money, the euro resembling the Deutschmark, resembling gold coins. Now, of course, I've promised myself that I'm not going to give an economics lecture here. And so allow me to stick to the aesthetic representation of the overlaying economic crisis. So the realm of symbolism has a great contribution to do to the understanding of the catharsis, free tragedy that is the Eurozone at the moment. Now, look at any euro note. See these bridges and arches and bridges and buildings? They don't exist. There's nothing real about them. A continent that is one of humanity's civilization cradles, that has produced stupendous cathedrals, breathtaking bridges, splendid modernist buildings, has hesitated to depict any of them on our notes. It has instructed designers to come up with fictitious bridges, arches, and buildings. Why? Out of fear of discontent and envy and soft money. If Italian Baroque is depicted, the Germans might worry that the euro will be devalued, considered to be associated somehow with Italian sloth and Mediterranean softness. If the Parthenon is featured, might this preclude or not preclude the European Union from booting Greece out of the Eurozone? Imagine Greece being thrown out of the Eurozone, but the Parthenon being on these things. Okay. And then, of course, if you preclude all Italian, Spanish, and Greek architecture, as well as artifacts, then how can you have the Cologne Cathedral on it? So you instruct designers to come up with stupid designs like this. I can think of no better metaphor for the remarkable turnaround that marks today's Europe. A continent that was for many years uniting under very different languages and cultures, today is being divided by a common currency. There is a delicious irony here. Now, those of you who are in art criticism understand all about irony in this postmodern world of ours. But only this is much more costly in terms of human lives. I won't dwell on the euro now and its toxic impact on Europeans, so let me go back to another kind of paradox. Now, money is the great atomizer. We have read novels, we've watched movies when confederates united until the moment that they steal the money, then look at the color of gold, look at the greenbacks stashed together, and their confederacy breaks down, and they start recriminations and end up invariably in jail. We can go all the way back again to Homer, because you may remember that Achilles, the great Greek Achaean hero, spent most of the Iliad striking. He was on strike. He was not participating in the Trojan War because he was peeved that his share of the initial loot was taken away by his king Agamemnon. And yet money, despite its atomizing effects, despite the fact that it is a solvent of solidarity and collaboration, is like language. It's purely Wittgensteinian. It is a collective achievement that is privately used and appropriated. It is like the ancient Greeks understood autonomy. Not the artifact of individuals, but something that is produced collectively, never autonomously. Exactly as wealth under capitalism. In California, in the United States, the world over. While the haves like to believe that their wealth is the product of their labor and ingenuity and good fortune, like money and language, their wealth has been collectively produced but privately appropriated. Money, to sum up, is political. And any attempt to depoliticize it is even more political. Indeed, it is deeply conservative and regressive to harbor thoughts of apolitical money. But such is history's penchant for irony that it took one of the most horrifically regressive and conservative politicians to speak the truth on the political nature of money. Mrs. Thatcher. Here she is on the day when she was dismissed by her minions, who coalesced amongst themselves to overthrow her, feeling that she was wrong on the question of European monetary union. Back to the euro now. Her opposition to the euro back in 1990 was a main reason, not the only reason, that on this day she shed a couple of tears in cabinet. She was forced against her will to resign. But then, Thatcher being Thatcher, got into her Rolls-Royce and drove to the House of Commons and delivered a speech on Europe, which was already scheduled. And I think it would be fun listening to a bit of it. If this thing wakes up.
What sort of vision do they have, Mr. Speaker? None, according to the right honourable gentleman. They want a Europe of subsidies, a Europe of socialist restrictions, a Europe of protectionism. They want it because that's how they would like to run, or is it to ruin this country? Yeah. Every time we've stood up and fought for Britain and British interests, the front bench opposite have carped and criticised and moaned. And on the central issues of Europe's future, they will not tell us where they stand. Do they want a single currency? The right honourable gentleman doesn't even know what it means or its consequences.
This was a warm-up, because now she's going to be asked the question, will she, following her resignation, continue to oppose an independent central bank and a single currency? And one of the opposite side interjects, as they do in the House of Commons, with a joke. She will be the governor of the European Central Bank. And listen to her answer.
I'm most grateful to the Prime Minister. Will she tell us whether she intends to continue her own personal fight against a single currency and an independent central bank when she leaves office?
No, she's going to be the governor.
On the present structure,
Order. The Prime Minister.
what a good idea.
There's a serious meeting.
But if I were, there'd be no European Central Bank accountable to no one, least of all to national parliaments. Because the point of that kind of European Central Bank is no democracy, taking powers away from every single parliament and being able to have a single currency and a monetary policy and an interest rates which takes all political power away from us. As my right honourable friend said in his first speech, after the proposal of a single currency is about the politics of Europe. It is about a federal Europe by the back door. So I'll consider the honourable gentleman's proposal. Now, where were we? I'm enjoying this.
As someone who spent 11 years opposing Mrs. Thatcher, I have participated in more than 200 demonstrations against her. To be using her as my role model in speeches like this is another example of history's ironic twist. Returning to the links between money and language for a moment, I hope you forgive me a sojourn into etymology. You asked for a Greek to give you a lecture, you'll suffer. Now, where do you go to see, to look at ancient coins? You go to a numismatic museum. That word numismatic comes from has the same etymology as nous, mind, nomizo, which is a verb which means to think, to believe, numenon, that which is thought of. The Greek word for coin is nomisma. And that resonates with Aristotle's idea that money has value if we believe it does. Speaking of Aristotle, besides his deep appreciation of the importance of belief and imagination in supporting the value of money, he has something else to contribute to our dystopian post-2008 world. Aristotle's teleological philosophical position led him to the conclusion that just like an arrow must have a target in order to be purposeful and meaningful, same with human activity. It must have a telos, an end, an objective, to be worthwhile. to be potentially virtuous. So boat building is a virtuous enterprise. Why? Because it has a telos, an end. And the end, of course, is when you launch the boat and the boat eagerly slices through the waves in search of other teloses or teli. Of course, boat builders need money in order to build a boat. So money making, if it remains a means to an end for Aristotle, is fine. But the moment one begins to make money for the purpose of making money, once it becomes a means to itself, money making is no longer a virtuous activity. When is enough enough? Never. There can be no telos to money making. Then the human is condemned to resemble a guinea pig on a treadmill, forever going faster and going nowhere. The opposite of eudaimonia, of a successful life. Because in that sense that there is, in ancient Greek, the ancient Greek mindset, something dangerous about money. Money is essential and at the same time to be guarded against. The myth of Midas tried to tell us exactly the same idea, that if everything you touch turns to gold, then soon enough you have a very awful death. Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven is also a good modern version of this sentiment that has given me a lot of pleasure over the years. But back to Aristotle. The idea of money breeding money is disconcerting to him, for it resembles a Frankensteinian-like sentient being capable of self-guided reproduction. Money begetting money was not something to be celebrated for Aristotle. On another etymological note, beget in Greek is known as toketos. Interest, as in interest rate, is tokos. And interest rate is epitokio. So this fear of money begetting money, of tokos, became a loathing for interest-bearing loans that today we associate with Islam, but which, as we know, up until fairly recently in the piece, was also part of, as Shakespeare's Shylock reminds us, part of the Christian tradition. Until Protestantism changed all that through predestination, through the elevation of accumulation to the pantheon of Christian virtues. Another manifestation of that is the transition from Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, who in the end gets his comeuppance and has to forfeit his soul to Mephistopheles, to Dr. Faust by Goethe, where Goethe allows Dr. Faust to get away with it. What was there in between Marlowe and Goethe? That transition whereby interest, toketos, tokos, money begetting money, becomes mainstream. Returning one more time to Aristotle and to the ancient Athenians, one might wonder what he might have answered to the question, okay, so what do you do with the bankers? A question that is prominent in our minds, has been for a while and should remain there. How should finance be restrained if money making money makes for a problem? The answer could not be more concrete than it was in ancient Athens. Again, I owe this to my father, it's something I didn't know. Did you know that bankers in ancient Athens were all exclusively slaves, as were the official testers of quality, the quality of wine, the quality of coins, whether they had been counterfeited or not? Why were they slaves? Because the city of Athens did not have the right to flog citizens, but it did have the right to flog slaves. So bankers were slaves exclusively so that they could be flogged if they attempted to go too far. If only President Obama knew this ancient Greek story, I trust that the Dodd-Frank and the Volcker Rule bills might have looked a little bit more different and possibly have a little bit more bite. My last sojourn into etymology has to do with the Greek word for money, which is chrima. Now, you all know Google's Chrome. That CHR has exactly the same etymology. Chrome comes from chroma, color. This is where Google gets it from. But it was a number of varieties. CHR eos, chreos, means two things in ancient Greek. It means debt and it means duty. Chrisi is use and utility. Chroma is color and chrima is money. So the words for debt and money are very highly correlated in ancient Greek etymology. And this is something that our friends from the modern money theory network, I'm not sure they know it, I may have to inform them of that, but I'm sure they would love it. But speaking of these etymological, not coincidences, but connections, perhaps those of you who ask the pertinent question, why is Germany so terribly despondent about the idea of debt? Let me remind you that the German word for debt, Schuld, is also the same word for sin. Okay. Going back to the MMT story and to this connection between debt and money. Now, archaeological research has shown, beyond any reasonable doubt, I believe, that the first instance of money comes from Mesopotamia. And it took the form of a ledger of debt. In particular, following the agricultural revolution and the fact that farming is a collective process, at least when it comes to warehousing wheat or corn, they had to have a ledger where they would write down that Mr. Mahmud or Nahmud, I don't know what the Mesopotamian names were back then, is owed so many bales of wheat. And these were written on stone, on shells, and these shells, after a while, became means of exchange. So the fact that you are owed something of value, a real asset like wheat, turns this debt obligation into a monetary unit. Now, what is even more fascinating is the evidence that the first coins to be used were not minted at least 150 years after they were used, which is a very interesting intertemporal substitution, isn't it? What I mean by this is this. There will be receipts written on shells that you are owed one coin, metallic coin, for the wheat or the corn that you have stored in the collective warehouse, right? And that was a kind of claim you had on a coin. And it now turns out that those coins were never minted. They were minted 150 years later. So the connection between metal, the imaginary, debt, time, and real production comes home immediately when we start contemplating this. Now, what was it that truly characterized the transition from feudalism to capitalism? I mean, of course, there are a myriad different answers to this question, but let me give you my abstract answer very briefly. It was a reversal of the chain of causality between debt, production, and distribution. In the era of Homer, or in the era of feudalism, peasants worked, or slaves worked, or free men worked, or women. There was production, there was a harvest. So production came first. Then came distribution. The sheriff would come on behalf of the Lord and pick up the Lord's lion's share. That's distribution. And finally, the Lord would sell whatever he couldn't eat, and his family couldn't eat, and his servants didn't need in order to be nourished, to rudimentary markets nearby or further afield, collect the surplus in monetary terms, and then lend it out. Act as a loan shark, effectively. So debt came last. So you had production, distribution, debt. With the enclosures in Britain, which gave rise to the commercialization of land and labor, to the creation of capitalism, in other words, what happened then? Suddenly, the peasants that had been thrown off the land, that had been evicted from the land, were given the opportunity, or some of them, very small number of them, to become quasi-entrepreneurs, to come back to the land, to rent the land out from the Lord, pay the Lord rent. But of course, they didn't have any money to pay the Lord. So what they did was they would have to borrow it from the Lord. So debt comes first. Okay? Then they would have to hire other workers, other ex-peasants, starving like them, in order to do the actual work. That's distribution. So we have a complete reversal. Whereas we had production, distribution, debt, now we have debt, distribution, and production comes last. Add to that mix a steam engine, and add further the idea of a banker, a loan shark, a lord, somebody who in the end becomes a financier, who does what? In order to support this mode of production, which begins with debt, what you need to do as a financier is you need to extend loans presently far in advance of the money that you have in your pocket or in some chest. So how do you do that? You just create it. You write an IOU, which then can be used by the ex-peasant in order to buy supplies to hire labor, and that becomes money. So in a sense, the banker, the financier, it is as if he is standing in front of a membrane that represents the timeline and puts his right arm, I'll say right, not left, through that membrane and grabs value that has not been produced yet from the future, just like those coins that had not been minted before, and brings it into the present, uses it in order to activate the production process, hoping that that production process is going to create enough value so that the future can be replenished, can be repaid with interest, with tokos. That, for me, was the fundamental, profound transformation that brought about capitalism, with all its capacity to unleash productive powers and to create mountains of wealth and mountains of poverty side by side, in this dialectical contradiction that capitalism is made of. Now, John Law was a figure from the 18th century who rose up in the French government very fast and furiously and managed to convince the French government and the royal family that he could push forward into the future the whole of French public debt, which was huge because of the wars that the kings back then used to persecute on the basis of that. A form of this kind of intertemporal substitution that modern monetary theory is concentrating on writing about. For a while it worked, but the more successful he was, the more eager he became to do more of it. And indeed it is true. If credit is imaginary, why not imagine a great deal of it? So the point I'm making is that something real must underpin this process. The intertemporal substitution, that right arm of the financier that goes into the future and brings value into the present. Why do we have crises one after the other? Because bankers overdo it, and that the present cannot produce the value that the future demands. And then we have a crash. And then what happens? The powers that be, the bankers and the states, conspire to ensure that the little people who never borrowed are the ones who repay. And that was the case in the 18th century, in the 19th century, in 2008, in 2014. But what is it really that value is all about? Because if money needs real value to be backed up, at least at some point, what is that real value? It can't be gold, because gold means nothing. There may be oodles of gold on Mars, but it's completely and utterly valueless. Now, at this point, I have to bring in the matrix, because it's the best way I can make the next point which I want to make. And that is that it is only human labor that creates value. If you watch the movie, the world looks like a mechanical clock. Or actually, not so much a mechanical clock, a digital clock, or a digital watch. You have different kinds of machines that have taken over the planet. They function like an organized political economy. They have division of labor. They produce a lot of stuff. They've populated the planet. They keep reproducing and improving themselves, so they have research departments where robots improve other robots and fix robots that are faulty and so on and so forth. And humans remain on this planet as batteries, as sources of energy plugged into the system, this dystopian view. Now, the reason why I think that it's analytically very important, of course the matrix has been used philosophically, aesthetically in many ways, but why I think that from a political economy point of view, it is a central movie. It is because it speaks to the question of what is it that creates value. Does it make sense to speak of value in that machine economy? I don't think so. It's like looking inside your watch and trying to find a value system. I mean, if you're an engineer, you don't need the concept of value. You have the concept of function. You know what each part of the machine is doing, so that when they collaborate with one another, the watch produces the right time. But the concept of value is superfluous. It's access to requirements. Similarly, in that society, where you have machines, there's absolutely no need to discuss in terms of value. You only need an engineer to tell you how this roboticized economy works. Even the humans in it, because they have no willpower, they have no consciousness, they have no capacity through critical judgment to make any difference to this world. They are just, they can be thought of as the battery that keeps your watch working. So if human labor and human ingenuity and this mystery, which is the human spirit, is what creates value, we have a very interesting way of re-understanding, of rethinking capitalism, which is, of course, not new at all. It's Karl Marx. I'm sorry, but that's the way it is. Because what was Marx's point? Marx's point was that the firm, the enterprise, the corporation, is the last oasis from markets. When you are inside a corporation, there is no market. You may have the complete triumph of capitalism and the markets. Everything can be commodified, including, women's wombs, the stars, DNA. But you cannot commodify what happens inside the corporation. What happens inside the corporation is a power network, a social relationship. And if you don't have that social relationship, then you end up with matrix, which is a lot of function, no value, no possibility of profit. So you have this epic drama that Marx captured quite brilliantly. Of one hand, employers having inexorable pressure placed upon them to turn us into androids. But if they do, then no value is produced and they go bankrupt. And that is an explanation, both of why money goes through trials and tribulations in terms of the fluctuation of its value, of why debts lead to crisis. There is no such process in a matrix-like economy. And why we, in the end, both capitalists and proletarians, dispossessed people sleeping on the street and intellectuals who are at Berkeley University discussing all these matters without worrying about how they will produce surplus value for themselves or for anybody else. Why we're all caught up in this epic drama, which fluctuates, which is uncertain, except in that it produces increasing degrees of misery and increasing degrees of wealth, invents beautiful gadgets and new forms of deprivation constantly. So the question, of course, is what makes us human? And this is a question that has been answered very nicely in this movie, so I don't need to say anything more beyond that. So the question is, are we going to end up as a matrix, simulacrum, or something closer to Star Trek? I don't know whether you noticed, there's no money in Star Trek. In Blade Runner, there's money. There are corporations. The struggle for defining what constitutes a human, which is the essence of Blade Runner, goes hand in hand with money, corporate power, and exploitation. Here, there is no money. This is perfect communism. Yeah? That's what Star Trek is. Nobody works. There is a hole in the wall that produces anything you want, right? There is no employment contract between anyone and anyone. So what do? Is they just explore the universe and they try to work out the relation with the Klingons.
Aesthetic deprivation.
Well, that wasn't bad for 1967. Compare it with today's television. So just to bring this to a close, Friedrich von Hayek is a radical voice on precisely the opposite side of the spectrum to me, and to people like me, and I think that to some of you too. But he's a radical voice nevertheless. Speaking of money, in 1972, a year after Connolly killed off the gold-dollar relationship, Hayek published an article in which, having understood that gold is finished, he had to come up with an alternative fantasy of apolitical money. And in that article, he argued against fiat money, against government money. He argued in favor of private money. And what was his idea? That anybody should be able to issue currency and let currencies, different currencies, issued by you, me, the University of Berkeley, of California, the Bank of America, Apple, whoever wants to issue currency, let those currencies compete against each other, and the good currency, sound money is going to win. That way, you maintain the notion that you can have apolitical money, market-determined money, but you decouple it from the idea that you tie money to gold, and that's how you keep it apolitical. Now, Hayek, unbeknownst to him, and in a way that he did not appreciate it, he would not have appreciated, was very prophetic. By the late 1990s, we had private money. They were called CDOs, and CDO squares, and ABSs, and all these toxic derivatives that Wall Street was producing. What were these derivatives? They were means of exchange and stores of value that Lehman Brothers and JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs were producing and procuring without any regulation, and still that money reached $750 billion inside the West's banks. And it's the money that burnt out in 2008, and of course, Main Street had to bail them out. Now, more recently, there is another fantasy, postmodern fantasy regarding the form of money. Now, have you noticed that you all know about Bitcoin? You don't need me to introduce it to you. Now, Bitcoin is celebrated for being immaterial, for being digital, for being a string of numbers. And yet, every article, every depiction depicts it in the context of silver and gold. I think that should concentrate our minds. I'm not going to explain to you why this is a dangerous fantasy, except to say that it is a dangerous fantasy because all notions, as Thatcher so poignantly put it, of apolitical money hide a highly political, regressive, anti-democratic, dictatorial agenda behind them. This one is not dictatorial. This is just a Ponzi scheme. However, I spent quite a few months, almost a year, studying the spontaneously emergent currencies inside video game communities when I worked for Valve Corporation in Seattle back in 2012. It was absolutely fascinating. These were not Ponzi schemes. These were real currencies that allowed almost 200,000 people to make a decent living by playing these games and producing new designs of currency-like items for these video game communities. When you had 14-year-old boys, mostly boys, in China, in Shenzhen, in Kansas City, in the Ukraine, and in Russia, making $80,000 a year of real dollars, not bitcoins, out of this activity, then you realize that what you have here is real currencies. What you have here is real economies. Now, when I say real, we have to be circumspect about them. Even though they operated exactly like one would expect a market-based capitalist economy to, if one is particularly unschooled as to what capitalism is, if you look more closely, these economies were not capitalist. They were market-based, but not capitalist. Why weren't they capitalist? What's the difference between a market-based economy and capitalism? I think I've already explained it. There was no labor contract involved in there. Everybody was a businessman or woman for himself or herself. There was no employment contract. In these video game communities, nobody works for anybody else. If you are producing a digital item of value, okay, then what happens is that it gets sold and you make money. But you are never dependent upon the willingness of another to give you a capacity to eke out a modest existence through operating with capital goods that your employer owns while your employer extracts surplus value from you. So in a sense, these video game communities, even though they are extremely sophisticated, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people playing and creating billions worth of real dollars of value in the form of digital currencies that evolve spontaneously as Hayek would want them to evolve. And yet, this is a parallel universe. To the extent that it does not create the dialectics of the labor relationship and the capital relationship, it was never a real capitalist economy. And it can never be one. So it will always be in a state of atrophy, attached to the real capitalist economy. Now, this is not new either. During the Second World War, in prisoner of war camps, there were very interesting market economies operating in which usually cigarettes played the role of currencies, of money. And what did they have in common with these video game community economies? The lack of labor markets. So prisoners of war would receive from the Red Cross a box every second week or so containing a bit of chocolate, a bit of tea, a bit of, a can of tuna, some cigarettes, of course. And they would trade with one another. And they would trade very vigorously. And there would be a very complex economy, just like in the video game economies. But you wouldn't have one prisoner of war working for another. And this is what prevented these postmodern or pre-modern or wartime economies from market economies from emulating capitalism. So in a sense, all this talk about Bitcoin and video game communities having surpassed the limits of the imagination of all this like me boils down to this. Because this, which is where I started from, was a similar economy. Little cards that kids wanted, exchanged with one another, and some of these cards, like Magic of the Spell, turning out to be the currency. To round off, drawing to a close, the elephant in the room, that was my talk here today, for most part of its part, is perhaps the greatest factor in determining the role of modern money. The extractive power exercised by elite on non-elite groups, while at the same time shrouding social power in a veil of obfuscation. Money in its many various forms plays a gigantic role in this process, and none more so than the fantasy that it can be apolitical. For as long as this continues, money will remain a rather blunt instrument, a primitive tool in the service of maintaining a primitive social order that constantly spews crisis, deepens discontent, and champions inequality. In juxtaposition, our more sophisticated tool as humans is the capacity critically to reflect on the norms that supposedly ought to govern our behavior. And this entails a capacity to question the value of money and the values of those who are besotted with it. Thank you.
I'm an artist coming from Greece, and the project, It's Time to Open the Black Boxes, is actually the result of the lack of money in Greece, which brought the economic crisis. So maybe it's the opposite way. Anyway, it's the result of the economic crisis in Greece. Yanis and I are together, and I live with him for the last 10 years almost. So I'd been hearing so much about the economy and this crisis, and he's been talking and commenting on it. And as an artist, the crisis in Greece was a bit slow. It came in around 2009. And by 2010, from 2008, 9, 10, every funding for art, every project stopped existing. There was no opportunities. So in a way, for 2 years, I had been listening to all. I don't know if you can hear me or where. Okay, great. Okay, so I'd been listening to all this commentary and the disaster that was going to come, and I could only feel that I could not produce any work because there were no commissions, no funding, and all that. So at some point, it was the week that they found the plane that had crashed, going from South America from Paris to South America, 2 years earlier than that. It was 2008. But in 2010, they found the black box of that airplane. And it was the same week that I think there was big talk about WikiLeaks. And somehow, it clicked in my mind, and this is what happens with artists, I suppose. It clicked that the black boxes is what you find. You find in the black box of an airplane the results of what brought a crash. And the title, "It's Time to Open the Black Boxes," was somehow a warning. For me, it clicked to me. The black box gave me form through which to talk, through which to express these ideas that I wanted through an artistic form to express. So it's sort of by opening the black boxes and bringing to light, which is there is the connection with the WikiLeaks, all these issues that are bringing us to a disaster, maybe we can avoid the final crash. So there is a sense of alarm and of time, which explains the title, the exclamation mark, and let me just see. Sorry, I've mixed up a bit, but so this was, yeah, the main sort of idea. So I was very happy to have found this idea, the black box, the form. It was going to have words and numbers, and this is the thing, that the words were not enough just to bring the words, but I needed to connect them to numbers and to a sense of alarm. That it's like a time bomb, that if we don't do anything to change course, then we will have the final crash. So we started thinking with Yanis about what those words would be that are in the boxes and how this could sort of work. But then the crisis became worse and worse, and people started committing suicide around us. So I thought I need to involve the society, the people, and this needs to reflect what people think and what they are threatened of. So the project evolved. And I came out with through social media, asking one of these people to reply to me with one word on either what threatens them the most or what they believe is being threatened and is that would be extinct. So we created a blog where people could submit their word. And I had more than 1,000 submissions, of which I chose about 80 words. The 20 words were the words that are connected to the economic crisis terminology. So this was a map of how I'm sorry, I'm going up and down. Let me just explain the installation. There were 100 of those boxes. And each one has a word and a number that comes after it, and it's a count up or a countdown number that either ends up in a flat line or in a bone. So it was I created. So I needed to make this map. So the purple words, the purple boxes, have words that are connected to the economic crisis. The pink area, which is the central area, is what we want to protect. The orange area on the back is what threatens us the most. and the blue and green are climate change, connected to the climate change. So when one walks into the exhibition, they come across the terminology of the economic crisis, which are these toxic money that Yanis was talking about before, the CDOs and all that. And then the numbers that follow these are numbers that are billions and trillions. So if we don't do anything to change the course of the accident, to open the boxes, to change course, then what this will multiply to 1 million. I don't know if I'm making sense because it's too short a time, and this is a very complicated project to explain. So somehow, let me just go forward to. Yeah, so then I had to find ways of how do the words and the numbers connect. So always with having in mind that if we do nothing to change, this projects into the future, and this would happen. So for example, climate change or oceans. I counted ocean, I got the volume of water of the oceans on the planet, and this works as so oceans appears on the box, and then there's a countdown that if we do nothing to do anything about protecting the climate, then the oceans will not really disappear, but there will be an end, a flat line. And in this way, I started working on all the different, each word I had to find a way of measuring it, and relating it to its equivalent number. So I took, all the front area, which was the purple ones relate to money, the central area, which was what we feel that we want to protect, and it's closer to us, like home, love, Greece for some, and all that. I tried to find a number which was close to the human being, so that was 100, like an eon, a century. So we would, if we don't do anything to protect our homes or whatever, then it starts from 100 and it goes to 0, and then there's a flat line. With the orange words that were like hunger or violence or divisions, this is what tends to happen, that we tend to lose control of the human scale. So I measured it up to 1,000. So it goes away from the 100 and it goes to 1,000. And then with the climate change words, which are the wilderness, forests, life, oceans, and all that, I did what I said before. So I tried to calculate volumes or real numbers, and what would have, so that the forests, for example, cover an area of 10 million whatever acres, and there's a countdown that goes to 0, and that means that there's a flat line in the end. So this was a bit how this became a living organism in a way. So it's a concept that one has of a black box or what this can mean. And then in order to relate ideas, basically what I'm trying to say is that in a different way, an art form is trying to raise awareness about the world that we live in a very different way to what an economist or an academic like you will speak about something much more, but in a